Story 1. The children were unwise, the teachers were unwise, and I was unwise. It was simply a building filled with unwise individuals. Story 2. Unmedicated attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and a boring curriculum made it difficult for me to focus. I often found myself thinking about things that provided me with excitement, like animals or video games, while the teachers were giving their lessons. In high school, I stopped attending classes altogether after getting my driver's license. Fortunately, I graduated fairly quickly from an alternative school. I was quite irresponsible and wild as a kid. Story 3. Many people say they dislike school because it felt rigid, overly focused on grades, and did not always value creativity or individual interests. It can also be socially stressful or feel disconnected from real-life skills. Story 4. I don't dislike school, but I am not comfortable with the idea of spending half my life on it without a guaranteed job. Story 5. Ridiculous rules, bullies, cliques, and boredom made high school unbearable for me. I skipped prom and graduation night. I didn't want a class ring, and if my parents hadn't insisted, I would have skipped the graduation ceremony entirely. I left as soon as I received my diploma and didn't even look for my parents afterward. I felt guilty for robbing them of their moment, so when I went to college, which I loved, I proudly participated in the ceremony, and we all went out to celebrate. Story 6. I was overweight and bullied for my appearance and my good grades. My parents never supported me and just told me to turn the other cheek like a good Christian. It reached the point where I was beaten up, and they still didn't intervene on my behalf. Story 7. I likely have undiagnosed attention deficit/hyperactivity disorder. I struggled to pay attention, was often unaware of what was happening, didn't complete homework, and faced reprimands for it. Now at 38, I remain undiagnosed, but I have learned to better mask my symptoms and can at least pretend to accomplish tasks. I really should figure this out. Story 8. It was mainly my other classmates who made it difficult, but I also felt more inadequate because the one subject I struggled in was mathematics. I was behind the rest of my classmates in regular math classes. Turns out I have dyscalculia. Story 9. There were many reasons I disliked school. For my childhood self, many were immature. As an adult, I understand that the American education system is, regrettably, a waste of time. It spends excessive time boring students with information they care little about without attempting to explain why this information is important. Then we judge these students' social worth based on how well they can regurgitate that information on a test. This fosters a culture of resentment towards education and intellectuals among students who are not intellectually gifted or naturally interested in the topics being taught. I believe this is one of the direct causes of the rise of anti-intellectualism in America, an irony that I recognize. When individuals correlate their school experiences with learning, they are less likely to pursue self-education or listen to those who attempt to educate them, and they are likely to feel resentment towards people they perceive as smarter than themselves. This is why they listen to individuals like Joe Rogan. He engages with them without treating them as less intelligent. Story 10. Because I knew the material, they still wanted me to do homework. I tested high, but my teachers genuinely wanted to fail me because I refused to do homework. This was during elementary and middle school. School became enjoyable once I reached my sophomore year in high school. However, I found most classes very boring outside of physical education. I actually felt challenged there. Story 11. I was very depressed, failing important classes, had few friends, and was being picked on. I also had insomnia, which caused me to fall asleep in class frequently. Story 12. I didn't enjoy subjects like math, Latin, and music theory. I wanted to learn more about science, philosophy, history, and other interesting topics. I also wish I had learned Japanese instead of Latin. Story 13. Schools do not actually teach you anything useful. They indoctrinate you to memorize instead of think for yourself. Story 14. It was a homeschool program full of mothers trying to live vicariously through their children. The curriculum was intense, starting high school level material in middle school and university level by the sophomore year, including subjects like Latin, philosophy, debate, and Western civilization. With such a high level of education, you find yourself surrounded by individuals who are essentially geniuses, convinced they are better than you and determined to see you fail. The students might call you their friend but will sabotage you at every opportunity. That experience really ruined school for me in general. Story 15. I didn't love school, but I loved learning. You're in a building full of kids who don't know themselves yet, which leads to a lot of stress. If your school doesn't have structures to address that, and very few in the United States do, you're likely facing a population that dislikes school. But the learning part is so wonderful, and I miss it. I also really dislike when people are hard on teachers. If you haven't been a teacher, let me tell you how challenging the job is. You may have had a bad teacher, maybe even two. I certainly did. But many teachers are there with the goal of helping you. Even if they struggle with it, they're still there. And it's not for the pay or respect. I can assure you of that. Story 16. I felt trapped. I didn't like the idea of not being able to come and go freely during my junior year. The last 3 periods of my day were study halls, and I didn't like the fact that I couldn't attend my actual classes and then leave. Story 17. Because I couldn't go a day without being tormented by classmates. By the end of senior year, the only people I felt comfortable around were 4 of my teachers. Story 18. I was bullied for 12 years and often completely ignored. I had very few friends and attended a difficult school that was filled with violence, drugs, and regular incidents involving knives and beatings. The joke is on them now, as I have become quite successful. Story 19. Social anxiety has been a challenge for me. Constantly moving and being bullied at some of the schools I attended made it difficult to feel comfortable anywhere. I did not complete any grades above 6th, but I have obtained my General Educational Development Certificate and have taken some college classes. Story 20. Because it is currently set up and used in a way that encourages children to compete with each other and work long hours, it punishes kids for not showing up by taking away more of their time and pushes them to rely on elected officials to solve their problems. Essentially, the state uses education to turn children into workers who do not question their relationship with production in a capitalist society and to discourage them from challenging authority. Education, in the hands of the upper class, is a tool of manipulation and oppression. I am not suggesting that what is taught is deceitful by some hidden government, although there is a tendency in my country to spin information and avoid embarrassing topics. However, the environment in which learning takes place is not conducive to effective education. This perspective is based solely on my experience within the education system. I cannot speak for experts, but teachers and unions in my country are certainly not satisfied with many aspects of the current situation. Story 21. I'm autistic and needed some special education. Instead, I received comments like, "You are so smart. Why are your grades so bad?" Story 22. Public schools cater to the lowest common denominator. I was bored and begged my parents to homeschool me. I ended up reading, sleeping, and drawing to pass the time because I always finished my classwork early or read ahead and completed the textbook. Story 23. It was boring. Everything was so slow, even the classes that attempted to motivate me were slow. I usually finished my work and homework in class before the bell would ring. Story 24. School treated me poorly. The teachers, staff, and students were all unkind. I was targeted multiple times, often bullied, and I had a teacher tell me to end my life in the middle of class. I was banned from prom and listed in the yearbook as the biggest troublemaker. I wasn't getting into fights, damaging school property, or talking back to teachers. I was merely trying to survive. I am now 32 years old and still dealing with the trauma from that time. Story 25. Bullies were essentially protected by the school if they were athletes. It wasn't until I was hospitalized that the superintendent, who worked with my mother, took action and removed several of the district's athletic departments that had been covering up instances of assault and battery. Story 26. I was raised to be a person who questions everything, and most teachers don't appreciate that. My household also emphasized history and understanding topics thoroughly, so most subjects I encountered in school felt boring to me because I had already learned about them in real life. Research was like a hobby in my family. Story 27. Because I was lonely. I still am, but it's easier to be lonely as an adult, out of school and focusing on my own life. Story 28. I couldn't stand being around people for 40 hours per week. I also had little to look forward to, so there was not much motivation to do well in school. Story 29. I was accused of having a hit list, and there were concerns that I was going to commit an act similar to the Columbine tragedy. I was removed from classes, my room was searched, and my drawings were destroyed by the police. I was also forced into therapy with a school-approved psychologist before I was allowed to return. To answer the inevitable question, no, I did not have a hit list, nor did I have any plans to harm anyone except for myself, but that's another story. Story 30. I didn't hate learning. I enjoyed my classes and loved my teachers. I was a good student. I did hate being bullied. I was bullied for being a smart, quiet child. However, those bullies are no longer in my life, and I still have the knowledge I gained. Story 31. They turn learning, which humans are naturally inclined to do, into a chore. If the system were perfect, graduation would not be as much of a celebration but rather a milestone. Story 32. I thought it was a waste of time, and it was. However, I would trade anything to go back in time and be a kid again. I'm definitely not trying to use time travel to buy Bitcoin. Story 33. In my area, there was a predominant religion with which most people identified. I felt that if you were not part of this religion, they would generally not want to associate with you. Story 34. Because I had to be the best in everything to meet my birth mother's expectations. She is in her 80s and still hasn't recovered from the fact that I ranked 6th out of 300 students in mathematics. I feel like a failure to her. Story 35. Certain teachers and the principal had a vendetta against me due to my last name. I was quiet and well-behaved, but they still found reasons to punish me, even if they had to get creative. Story 36. I didn't care about high school. I wasn't interested in most of the curriculum, there were too many rules, many people were unsupportive, and I struggled in several subjects which affected my motivation and confidence. It was mentally draining. I graduated with a low GPA. College was a great experience. I would do it again. I graduated with a GPA of 3.5 and now have a successful career in my field. It did get better. Story 37. Boring general education classes and groups of people who thought they were better than others. At least I wasn't bullied, though. Story 38. Somewhere between the sexual abuse and relentless bullying, I decided that I would rather go skateboarding and smoke cannabis. Story 39. Because I was never good enough for my peers. I was made fun of for my clothes from 3rd grade on, then for my weight. Once I lost the weight, I still wasn't good enough. Then it was my teeth. There was always something. Story 40. It felt like a prison to me. I disliked classroom settings. Now that I'm older, I enjoy them when I find the subject interesting. Story 41. Literature and English are combined into one subject. Literature is entertainment, while English focuses on reading, writing, and communicating. They are not the same, yet they are treated as such academically. I understand that it is important to learn about literary history, but it is not necessary to read many complete texts of historical literature to grasp that history. This is especially true for plays, which were never intended to be read like books. When writing papers related to this assigned work, teachers often impose their subjective perspectives, insisting there is a right way and a wrong way to view things. This content should be moved to a history class, and the subject should not be elevated to levels of importance that it does not warrant. Story 42. Violently mistreated by the adult staff, psychologically, verbally, and physically. It was the 1970s and 1980s in Ireland. Story 43. Autistic and diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I wasn't necessarily bullied, but I felt overwhelmed by my environment and frustrated with those around me. The subjects offered did not interest me as I wanted to explore topics that captured my attention, leading to accusations of laziness. Eventually, I enrolled in a homeschool program and things improved. Story 44. I didn't find it engaging. I hated the subjects that held little or no interest for me. I loved and thrived in classes like woodworking, drafting, and metalworking. However, I could not get through subjects such as biology, history, and languages. Felt like pulling teeth. To this day, I struggle to stay awake during those types of subjects. Story 45. I have a few reasons. There was significant competitiveness around grades, with students constantly being judged for scoring below 60% in any subject. I was on a basketball team that organized a fundraiser for a cancer charity, but instead of the charity receiving the money, it went to the volleyball team for new uniforms for the third consecutive year. Meanwhile, the charity for which we raised money had already contacted us but received nothing, and our team had been using the sweaty jerseys from the men's team for 4 years. I remember the lovely cafeteria staff who would give us an apple if we were short on money. They were later replaced by a health food company that charged twice the price and always served extremely cold meals. This change occurred after the student union complained about the lack of healthy alternatives. Story 46. I didn't hate school. I was not supported or encouraged to do well beyond physical punishments. I also feel that school is just conforming young people to comply with the workforce. What are we learning? Story 47. It took the enjoyment out of learning. I have learned more about history and government from infotainment shows than I ever learned in school. Story 48. What I have gathered over the years on this subject is that I did not have an interest in the subjects. I am fine with school when it is for something that interests me. The basic subjects simply are not that. Story 49. I was an undiagnosed autistic girl who wanted nothing more than to blend in and hide from everyone. I am so thankful I attended a small school. I do not know how I could have handled a larger one. Story 50. I didn't have friends, and I didn't like how it felt to memorize things only to forget them. It didn't seem like I learned anything at all. Story 51. I loved school. I only disliked most of my fellow students. I experienced the misfortune of my family moving from a regular suburb to a wealthy one, and I never really integrated with the kids who acted like they were socially superior. In retrospect, they probably weren't that bad, but at the time, it certainly felt that way. Story 52. It wasn't so much the other kids. For some reason, the music teacher branded me a troublemaker. She just didn't like me, and the principal went along with it. Anything that went wrong was somehow my doing, even things that happened when I wasn't there. If I was gone for a doctor's appointment, I would return to accusations of breaking a window. I received 5 days of in-house detention. The principal even sent me down to the resource classes for students with learning difficulties because I had detention nearly every week. I found out later in life that they all belonged to the same large church, and anyone who wasn't part of it was on their blacklist. Story 53. Work hard in high school to get into a good college. Work hard in college to get a good job. Work hard at your job to earn a promotion, and so on. School is just the first step in the race of life that you dedicate a significant portion of your time to, and it can be challenging. Story 54. I was bullied in grade school and middle school, and no one helped me. As a result, I became angry and assumed that everyone was a potential bully, distancing myself as much as I could. I continued to be bullied by older students, so distancing didn't really help. Story 55. Bullies in high school. Oddly, I became a high school teacher, and I can confidently say that much of the character education offered now is helping significantly. It has not eliminated bullying, but it is much less common than it was in the 1980s. Story 56. I managed to do well in elementary and middle school, but I hated high school. High school was very cliquish. I wasn't a jock, nerd, preppy, geek, or goth. I refused to be something I wasn't just to fit in. I was a loner and kept to myself. I can't express how happy I was to graduate from high school. Story 57. I loved school until bullying started. Being made fun of and threatened affected me. I was somewhere between a wallflower and popular. I would have excelled and stayed in school if it weren't for that reason. Story 58. I hated being bullied, and I also disliked being an unattractive guy because it was clear to me how harshly nature can treat a man. When he tries to talk to a pretty girl and she turns her back on him, he only sees her rear and becomes infatuated. What a joke. I'm glad those days are over. Story 59. I was a tomboy, shy, and didn't fit in. I moved away as soon as I graduated, and that was when I started opening up. Story 60. I was bullied severely, and then I started bullying my bullies. This became a problem for me because I was constantly getting into fights, Aside from that, I was learning subjects that I am never going to use again. Story 61. I faced a lot of bullying since middle school. It was awful. In high school, I sometimes ate lunch in the bathroom. Story 62. I used an elevator to go down. I went in with my friend, and there were other students inside as well. A teacher saw this and only asked me if I had a pass to use the elevator. I said no, and she told me to get out. I waited to see if she asked the other students, but she did not. She was using the elevator for the same reason we were, as many students were in the hallway talking and not moving. Story 63. It was a literal nepotism contest. The teachers did not have the answers I needed. They cannot teach me what they do not know. I was never interested in the subject matter until college. Story 64. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Depression. Anxiety. Honestly, the way they teach is not how I learn. However, I excelled in classes with exceptional teachers. Story 65. Still in school, I have so much to say about this. First, the curriculum. It's too slow in some subjects like science, which feels very surface level, and far too fast in others. We are expected to learn the history of our country in detail, from the coming of St. Patrick to the present day, all in 3 years of school. I dislike the textbooks for most subjects and their overly simplified ways of presenting the information when there's a summary available at the back. I know this doesn't apply to all schools, but I dislike that we don't have assigned reading during the year. We rarely see citations, except maybe in history, which I appreciate. Most of the time, you don't know where to go if you enjoy a subject and want to explore it outside of school hours. We have a notoriously ineffective mathematics teacher who outsourced lessons. We often ended up watching tutorials on geometry instead. Not all teachers are bad, but it can be frustrating. I further dislike the idea of compulsory subjects, especially when they can be controversial. Religion is taught here as a subject, and to be exempt from it, you either have to inform the school that you belong to a different religion or go through a lengthy process of saying, "We don't think our child should be required to take religion as an exam subject," for which I'm very grateful to my parents. I also attend an all-girls school, which means that our elective subjects are quite limited. We are not offered computer science, woodworking, or robotics as options, which are available in other schools. It feels somewhat discriminatory and frustrating. Those were just the options I would have liked to take. I can't list them all. The most significant issue is the people at the school. I would say that ours is an overall. You can feel ostracized if you touch a book without being prompted by a teacher, or if you enjoy anime or manga. I dislike the division between groups within a class. It's very noticeable if you don't fit in. This often leads to friend drama. Especially now, with social media being pervasive and friend groups being so essential, you feel even more alienated when you're left out. I have about 5 friends that I genuinely like. I dislike pretending to be friends with people who bore me or expect me to conform to outdated stereotypes. If I don't, I risk being labeled a loner and subjected to juvenile pranks, like finding a dictionary on my desk before school, with others watching to see if I react. I'm not even particularly intelligent, but because I have interests outside of makeup and relationships, I'm stereotyped as a nerd. It's fine when my friends call me that, as it feels like a compliment, but when others do it, I feel unwelcome in their group. In summary, school can be frustrating. Homework is also annoying. Why are we expected to do so much work when we're already stuck in class for a significant part of our day? Story 66. I loved learning. However, when it came time to do presentations, I would always refuse because I had terrible stage fright. Teachers would be frustrated with me for that. I once had an English teacher call my mother for not wanting to recite a poem in front of the class. Story 67. I am currently in school. I am not a big fan of it. It is just boring, and I do not like being forced to wake up so early. The people are annoying as well. Story 68. Because it was so boring. Almost none of the teachers, except for those in the arts, were particularly engaging. Nearly all lessons were a short monologue, followed by the teacher writing things on the chalkboard, while we silently copied them into our notebooks. I had some fun in drama and music classes, as there was more opportunity for creativity, but those classes weren't as prevalent as the core subjects. We wrote notes from the chalkboard and were sometimes given take-home quizzes to spend our evenings on, only to come back and do it all again, all the while looking out the window at the bright sunny day. Story 69. Being forced to get up in the morning when I'm built to be a night owl means I don't go to sleep until the sun starts lighting the sky. Having to deal with adults who think their greater age gives them a higher intelligence quotient than mine, I have an IQ of 182, and that they possess a fountain of wisdom is frustrating. All the different tasks I am supposed to complete to prove I am smart enough to learn were unnecessary because I already understood the assignments before they were taught. I was genuinely interested in learning. Felt pointless, like I was repeating myself. Then finally, the bullies. I use quotes because I was just as much, if not an even bigger, jerk in response to them. The reason I quit school was that the superintendent had it out for me after I revealed several secrets. I was a quiet kid, very aware of the conversations around me, resulting in a teacher losing their job and another student quitting. Essentially, I was just a teenager mad at the world, lashing out because I thought it would make me feel better about being punished for seeking an education. Story 70. My teacher was teaching how to add matrices the other day. To a class full of juniors, she asked what 1 plus 2 was. Additionally, there was a whole lesson on adding and subtracting matrices. It is basic addition and subtraction. Could have taken 30 seconds. Story 71. I felt like an outsider. I was made fun of, bullied, and even beaten by classmates. Even teachers would have their fun when they could with their sly wit. I never missed school life. It was the worst part of my childhood. Story 72. I didn't hate learning. I hated the pressure, the comparisons, and the feeling that creativity didn't matter. It wasn't school itself, but how it made me feel constrained instead of inspired. Story 73. Because they controlled when I could eat and use the bathroom, it was not great for me as someone who experiences migraines if my blood sugar gets low and who also has irritable bowel syndrome. Do not get me started on the fluorescent lights, those are also a trigger. I was stuck in a place every day where I couldn't avoid the things that made me sick, and every emergency bathroom trip made me afraid of getting in trouble. Dehydration is another migraine trigger for me. A quick gulp from the water fountain was not enough to keep me hydrated. I was so happy when I found out my children's schools allowed them to have water bottles in class. One of my kids inherited the migraine gene from me, and I am grateful we could at least avoid that trigger. Story 74. I loved being homeschooled, but I disliked my traditional schools for various reasons. Bullying. Being smaller than most of my classmates and lacking physical strength made me an easy target for bullying, especially since I had a temper that couldn't be easily subdued. I was bullied every year, usually by girls who were clever or popular. Most boys liked me because I stood up for them and helped whenever I could. The girls operated as a collective. If one disliked you, they all did. Corrupt teachers. 3 teachers tried to undermine me in class. One frequently attempted to make me look foolish and altered my grades even when no assignments were given. I checked the website hourly and had screenshots for evidence. In one class, my grade dropped from an A to a B- despite not having any homework, quizzes, or tests. I had enough evidence to damage one teacher's career but reconsidered when I learned that her husband had lost his job and she was the sole income provider. I didn't want to put her family in a difficult position. Difficulty with scheduling. This may seem odd, but I struggled when required to adhere to their schedule. Transitioning from math to science to English was challenging for me. However, when I was homeschooled, I completed all my math in a month and then focused on the next subject. This approach allowed me to stay in a specific mindset for learning and made it easier for me to retain information. In the end, I achieved better grades than my peers and even received scholarship offers from 2 colleges, which I declined because they did not support certain values that I hold dear. Story 75. I can't sit still due to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I'm also a mix of weird and annoying, so I was quite unpopular. I had a few friends, so it was probably not as terrible for me as it was for others. It's not that I hated school. It was more that I had no reason to like it, except maybe for sitting quietly for hours. I definitely hate that. Story 76. Teach mostly practical skills, as some teachers acted entitled. There should have been more classes focused on real-world skills. Story 77. In the closet with awful untreated depression, anxiety, and untreated attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, I was miserable and difficult to be around. I was a good student in the sense that I always performed well on tests and was in gifted, honors, and advanced placement classes, but I never did my homework and was constantly falling asleep in class or drifting off, even in subjects I loved like science and English. I didn't mind school, I suppose, but I hated life in general. I'm honestly surprised, but glad, that I'm still around because it wasn't always likely to be the case. Story 78. Because I struggled with learning and had a poor attention span, being bullied didn't help either. However, I managed to cope with it myself, as I found teachers unhelpful in this regard. Story 79. Sometimes, because of bullies or bad teachers who didn't teach well, I am there to learn. Some of them had no clue. I didn't like the my way or the highway attitude. Story 80. Because I was bullied by other children and occasionally by the teachers. My mother and later my stepfather were teachers, and I grew up respecting them and doing my best to behave, as I believed my mother would find out if I got into trouble. I never attended a school where they taught. I didn't have many friends, if any, and I was made to feel bad about it. If I had learned to love myself more and realized I enjoyed my own company most of the time, I would have had a much better childhood and stood up for myself instead of worrying about making friends. I think I came off as desperate at one point. When I was around 9, I had a rather vindictive teacher. My mother moved me to a different school after hearing from other parents about how horrible the teacher was being to me when she thought I was just being overly sensitive. Later in my teens, I had an awful teacher who knew my mother and made my life difficult, trying to get me to quit my class. I learned that she picked a victim in every class she taught and made their life hell. I had her for 4 years, and she was the only teacher who gave me detention, which was for petty things when I wished I could have stood up to her. I spent half of my primary school discos reading in the library or hanging out with the class guinea pig when it was there. It was a bit of a party and then a chance to relax away from the noise and home life. Those were some of my best memories. I foolishly tried to teach years later and hated it. All of my mother's friends warned me not to pursue it, and they were right. Story 81. I don't hate it, but I wouldn't want to spend a lot of time being busy on something that might not be the actual ticket to a great future or help in building a good life. Story 82. I didn't hate school itself. I loved learning and growing, but as soon as I started working at around 17, the concept of hundreds of teenagers being confined in a space for 6 hours began to weigh on me, and my motivation took a significant hit. Waking up early in the morning just to sit for 5 hours began to drain me. Physical education was a good way to change the pace, but you could only take it for 1 semester each year, totaling 2 out of 4 years of the overall high school experience. That doesn't even factor in the extra credits in grade 12 that increase the workload and are all considerably more important than physical education. Thus, you're desk-bound even more. As for friends and relationships, I might do it all over again, but otherwise, no thanks. It's been 11 years since I graduated, and I can't imagine repeating it. I'm in the best relationship I've ever known, 5 years going strong, so come to think of it, I'm good. Story 83. They never explained why we were there. On the first day, we were learning the alphabet. Why? If someone had just explained it to me as if I were 5 years old, it could have gone much better. Story 84. I attended a small private school and truly disliked it. Everyone was always in your business because word spread quickly, and it was extremely cliquey. I also dealt with complicated family issues during high school, and looking back, it forced me to take on adult responsibilities at a young age, which didn't help. Story 85. Classes were boring me to death. There were good ones, and I participated well and had good grades in those. However, that wasn't the norm. Whenever a class involved mainly listening or reading, or covered a topic I wasn't interested in, I often thought about jumping out the window and running off, figuratively. My favorites were English and mathematics because they involved a lot of opening the book and doing tasks, keeping me well engaged. Story 86. I would have loved it if I hadn't been bullied by mean girls. My family didn't have a lot of money, so most of my clothes were old hand-me-downs from cousins and siblings. We never got cool new school shoes and couldn't afford name-brand items. I was also introverted, I think due to the bullying, so I didn't have many friends. Story 87. Attention deficit disorder, undiagnosed until age 50. School was challenging. If a subject came easily to me, I usually excelled. However, if it required long-term effort and practice, I often struggled with it. I only graduated high school because my cousin held an all-night study session with me just hours before my Algebra 2 final exam. I passed and would not have graduated otherwise. It was difficult to solve quadratic equations with distractions like birds flying by the window. Story 88. You're forced to do things you don't want to do every single weekday. Punished for having interests outside of the curriculum. Punished for trying to be creative. Punished for asking questions. I have been punished for reading when I wasn't supposed to. You learn to remain silent and do what you're told, and not to question authority, or you get punished again. I turned schooling into a competition without telling others. I chose a nemesis for each class and aimed for an A on everything, or I faced consequences. It didn't help much, though. You face criticism for being one of the smart ones, too. Luckily, I was also the teenager with a beard and looked like I was on my second divorce by the time I was in 6th grade. Some have said I might be autistic, but who knows? Story 89. Being bullied. Teachers are not willing to give me extra attention, as I have autism and sometimes need a bit of extra teaching to understand. I also lived at a closed-down swimming pool without hot water or privacy, which made my clothes smell bad, leading to additional bullying. Story 90. I attended competitive schools for a long time. I disliked how teachers pressured us to push our limits in subjects we did not enjoy. Story 91. Bullied. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, combined with above-average intelligence, resulted in extreme boredom. I slept through most of the day, did no homework, and woke up just long enough to perform well on tests, which mostly kept my grades up. Story 92. Because my classmates, most of them, hated me and shoved it right into my face. Luckily, I have graduated already. Story 93. Waking up early to attend a place where I was bullied and feared for my safety and social embarrassment was difficult. The structure of the school was not conducive to my learning either. We had 2 4-month semesters, each with 4 90-minute classes per day. I couldn't focus on my first class because I was preoccupied with the presentation I had to give in my second class. I couldn't concentrate in my third class because I was worried about the test in my fourth class. It was challenging to divide my attention among 4 completely different subjects in such a short time span. I always thought I would have learned much more if we had focused on just one class, one subject all day for a month. A full month of Spanish each day would have made me significantly more proficient than only 90 minutes a day interspersed with other classes. Story 94. I didn't. School was great, especially if it is an affordable college. Learning, gaining knowledge, exercising, and having close friends made for a simpler life. Story 95. Ridiculous rules were enforced, reflecting a rules for thee, not for me mentality among most of the staff. Any genuinely good teachers were considered the black sheep by the administration. Teachers' hands were tied. They couldn't punish disruptive students or provide proper teaching to those who were eager to learn. Most classes lacked challenge and primarily involved busy work. Story 96. The classes were not challenging enough for me, although I did not want more of a challenge. Despite this, it was enjoyable to hang out with people. Story 97. No matter how hard I worked, I could never manage to get an A in anything other than my special interest in English or subjects that were very easy. I was bullied and ostracized, even by my friends. You experience automatic tunnel vision because you have spent your life focused on school, so you don't necessarily know anything else. I commuted to college, which was challenging, and I made no lasting friends. In my experience, debt is not worth it. If I can avoid going back for the rest of my life, I will. Story 98. My classes were never at my level. They were always behind me. As a result, I would fail because they were boring. Eventually, I dropped out. However, I am a great self-learner, and once I left school, I hit the ground running. Story 99. Even if you say it was my fault, it was objectively boring. I could only think about the group of unengaged individuals to my left and a few more to my right. My school life was an incredibly unproductive experience, filled with personalities who should not have been teaching in the first place, and it negatively impacted my life. Story 100. Boring classes and teachers not helping children who struggle to learn like everyone else made me feel isolated. I tried to fit in and make friends, but I was usually alone. Story 101. I was taking a curriculum that my mother wanted me to pursue, despite the fact that it was obvious I didn't have the maturity or home environment to fulfill such a career. Story 102. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is often associated with a system designed for individuals who can sit still and focus on a wall, teacher, or book for 7 hours. I obtained my General Educational Development Certificate after dropping out and found learning much easier when I was in control. Story 103. Discrimination from administrators. Teachers always loved me, but the administration always hated me. Being at the top of my class never helped. Sometimes it only aggravated them even more. Story 104. There are quite a few reasons. 1. I was often bullied, and whenever I defended myself, I ended up in trouble. I felt lonely because there were so many groups and cliques that I was never a part of. Why can't homework stay at school? I absolutely hated sitting and listening to someone talk for 5 to 6 hours a day. Most of it was boring. It was painful to see my crush, knowing I had no chance, which mentally drained me. I struggled with every extracurricular activity I tried, and I felt that no one really helped me improve. I was bullied out of them. I had an hour-and-a-half walk to and from school every day. My anxiety issues originated in high school. Story 105. The competitive nature of law school creates significant anxiety. It is not just about knowing the law, it is about knowing the law better than your peers. In classes that are both dense and challenging, this can lead to high levels of stress. Wish me luck on my business organizations final. Everyone. Story 106. I think it's unwise that intelligence is measured by the ability to remember something for a week or two and then forget it, not in all cases but in many. Story 107. When I misbehaved, they would call my father, and he would come from home to discipline me in front of my class as a warning to others. Story 108. I had a love-hate relationship with it. I disliked the schoolwork, but I enjoyed having a central hub where I knew the majority of my friends were and could meet and spend time with them. Story 109. Homework was the sole reason I hated school. I could complete the assignments and demonstrate my understanding, but it didn't matter. If you didn't do homework, you weren't able to pass. Story 110. Homework. It might have been a sign that I had some form of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I struggled with homework throughout college and lost entire letter grades because of it. I can remember getting headaches doing math homework. Math was the worst for me. It must have been almost as frustrating for my parents and teachers as it was for me. Story 111. Being highly intelligent and quick to understand things compared to others. I struggled with severe attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I nearly dropped out of college during my freshman year until I discovered Ritalin. Graduate school suited my personality much better since multitasking and processing information are strengths in that environment. Story 112. It is very challenging in certain courses due to my dyslexia. I completed high school, but college is quite boring, and some teachers do not seem to care about their students, which is disappointing. Additionally, there are teachers who lack basic respect for students. One of my teachers was very rude to me because of my dyslexia. Although he did not know about my condition, I was afraid to tell him because I have trust issues. Story 113. Because I was in a class without any friends, and drama and physical education were too social, I dreaded the phrase "now get into pairs." My anxiety at school was overwhelming, and I took many sick days. As soon as I started my General Certificate of Secondary Education courses and could drop certain subjects to be in a class with a friend, I was perfectly fine. I believe that nowadays teachers would take my problems more seriously, but that's how it was. Story 114. I was a closeted queer individual in multiple ways and also autistic. I attended school in a religiously conservative area. Being the weird kid who seemed gay, though in a way no one could quite identify, during the 1990s and early 2000s was not an enjoyable experience. Story 115. My anxiety was overwhelming, and I felt like everyone disliked me. I felt inadequate compared to my peers. My family life at home was challenging, and I struggled with low self-esteem. Story 116. I received no support at home. My parents were not very educated and could not help me with my homework. They also did not think school was important, so they did not encourage me to persevere. There was no assistance with daily struggles, and they never attended parent-teacher night. I believe it would have helped me tremendously if I had received some support from them. Story 117. It is where I experienced the most bullying. It is where I felt I was never good enough, only achieving average grades. It is where my anxiety began due to constant worries about my grades. Story 118. I was in the special education class from elementary school until high school. In my senior year, I finally attended regular classes like math and history. I was also a super senior because my teachers required me to be one. Story 119. I was bullied badly and it was terrible. When I dressed for gym, they took my clothes and threw them in the showers. I had candy put in my hair, kids threw books at me, and I was pushed into lockers and locked in one. All because I was goth. It was absolutely ridiculous. Story 120. It wasn't school itself that I disliked. I would get distracted by everything, which led to trouble even with good grades. Paying attention was a challenge for me, and I learned topics on my own terms at home. I switched schools frequently, resulting in little to no social skills by the time I started middle school. My lack of friends made me a target for bullies until high school, when the bullying shifted online until I moved again. Story 121. Honestly, for me, it was never about bullying or the classes. It was the teachers. The number of teachers who cursed at me or directed their anger towards me was quite overwhelming. Even when I wanted to use my individualized education program accommodations, my English teacher would genuinely get mad and curse at me, insisting that I was unworthy of those accommodations. I had been fully diagnosed with attention deficit/hyperactivity disorder and dyslexia, and was on medication for both. The principal was even worse. Since I lived in a low-income area of Los Angeles, there were stereotypes about gang activity, and this woman, who graduated from Harvard, had a serious case of the savior complex. Felt like she viewed me as a charity case, which drove me insane. I wasn't a bad kid. I kept to myself in class and socialized a lot with other students during lunch. However, that school had a lot of crazy things going on. Not to mention, many of my teachers regularly broke federal and state laws. Story 122. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, depression, and anxiety contributed to a turbulent home life. I felt too distracted by my phone and other people. I would put myself in in-school suspension to have a less stimulating place to work. I dropped out the day I turned 18 and went to an alternative school. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.